The dust hung thick in the cold morning air as Mason Riggs wrestled with the frozen pump, his calloused hands cracking against the metal while the Montana winter seeped into his bones. 31 years old, and he'd already lived a dozen lifetimes, none of which had prepared him for the emptiness that came with settling down. His cabin stood as a testament to his solitude, sturdy logs stacked against the wilderness, but hollow inside, much like the man himself. The year was 1878, and Whitehorn, Montana was growing slowly but steadily, a small settlement tucked between rolling hills and pine forests. Mason had helped build half the town with his own two hands when he'd decided to hang up his gun belt 3 years ago. The bounty hunting life had left him with enough money to buy this plot of land and enough nightmares to fill it. "Come on, you stubborn thing," he muttered, giving the pump one final heave before water spluttered forth, ice cold and clear. He filled his bucket and trudged back to his cabin, boots crunching on the hard-packed snow. Inside wasn't much warmer than out. The fireplace stood cold, ash from yesterday's meager fire still scattered across the hearth. Mason set his coffee to boil and stared out the window at the road leading into town. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never did. The few friends he had knew better than to ride out this far during winter, and the rest of the townsfolk kept their distance from the former bounty hunter. So when he spotted a lone wagon making its way slowly toward his property, Mason's hand instinctively moved to the revolver that hung by the door. Old habits. The wagon drew closer, and he could make out a woman at the reins, bundled in heavy furs, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The wheels creaked to a halt about 20 feet from his porch. Mason stepped outside, his expression guarded. "You've taken a wrong turn, madam. Town's back that way," he called out, pointing behind her. The woman lowered the hood of her cloak, revealing a face framed by copper-red hair. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes held a determined gleam that caught Mason off guard. "Mr. Riggs?" she asked, her voice clearer and stronger than he expected. "I'm Bethany Roscoe. I believe you knew my husband, William." The name hit Mason like a physical blow. William Roscoe. They'd ridden together for nearly 2 years, tracking bounties across 3 territories, until that day in Colorado when things had gone wrong, very wrong. "Will's dead," he said flatly, the words still bitter on his tongue even after 4 years. "Yes," she replied simply, "for 4 years now." "I received your letter." Mason shifted uncomfortably. He'd written to her once, right after it happened, a brief, inadequate attempt to explain how her husband had died saving his life. "What brings you all this way, Mrs. Roscoe?" She gestured to the wagon behind her, loaded with trunks and crates. "I've come to claim the land adjacent to yours, the deed that Will left me. I understand it's just over that ridge." Mason stared at her in disbelief. "You plan to settle here alone?" "I don't plan to do anything, Mr. Riggs. I am doing it." She pulled the reins, guiding the wagon to continue past his cabin. "I merely wanted to introduce myself to my nearest neighbor." Mason watched her go, speechless as the wagon rumbled over the uneven ground toward the ridge that separated his land from the untouched plot beyond. Will Roscoe had bought that land on a whim years ago, talking about settling down someday. Mason never imagined the man's widow would come to claim it. For 3 days, Mason tried to ignore the situation. He went about his business chopping wood, tending to his small herd of cattle, repairing his tools, but his eyes kept drifting to the ridge. On the 4th day, when snow began falling heavily, something like conscience stirred within him. With a curse, Mason saddled his horse and rode toward Will Roscoe's property. The snow was coming down hard enough that he almost missed the small structure taking shape little more than 3 walls and the beginning of a roof. The wagon was parked nearby, a canvas tarp stretched over it for additional shelter. Bethany emerged from beneath this makeshift shelter, a hammer in her gloved hand. She wore men's trousers beneath her coat, practical for the work she was doing. "Mrs. Roscoe," Mason called out, dismounting, "this storm's going to get worse. You can't stay out here." "I have no alternative," she replied, straightening her back. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 27 or 28, with a dusting of freckles across her nose. "You'll freeze to death," he said bluntly. Your husband would haunt me till my dying day if I let that happen. Something flickered across her face, pain, perhaps, or memory. Will spoke of you often in his letters, said you were stubborn as a mule but loyal to a fault. He was half right, Mason muttered. Look, I've got spare room. You can stay at my place until this weather breaks, then we'll figure out something more permanent. For a moment he thought she would refuse, but another gust of icy wind seemed to make the decision for her. Very well, Mr. Riggs, but only until the storm passes. It took an hour to secure her belongings and lead the wagon back to Mason's cabin. By the time they arrived, both were half frozen and covered in snow. Mason stabled her horse alongside his own and carried her trunk inside while she followed with a smaller carpet bag. The cabin's interior seemed suddenly smaller with her presence. It was a simple structure, one main room with a fireplace, kitchen area, and table, plus a small bedroom sectioned off by a door in the back. Mason had built a small addition on the side that served as storage and workroom. You can take the bedroom, he said gruffly. I'll sleep out here by the fire. I couldn't possibly. It's not up for debate, Mrs. Roscoe. She pressed her lips together but nodded. Bethany, please, if we're to be neighbors, we might as well use our given names. Mason hesitated before nodding. Mason, then. He busied himself rekindling the fire while she explored the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings and the layers of dust that had accumulated on every surface. The place hadn't been properly cleaned in months, maybe years. When did you last air this place out? She asked, running a finger along a shelf and frowning at the dust it collected. Don't remember, he admitted. Don't see much point when it's just me. Bethany shook her head disapprovingly but said nothing more. Instead, she set about unpacking a few essentials from her carpet bag, a small framed photograph, a book, and a worn silver hairbrush. Mason watched her covertly as she moved around the space, disturbing years of settled solitude with each step. There was something both unsettling and oddly comforting about having another person in his home. Especially Hurwill's widow, the wife of the man whose death had driven Mason to this isolated existence. The storm howled outside, rattling the windows and sending drafts through every crack in the cabin walls. Mason had gotten used to the cold, but now, aware of his guest, he found himself adding more logs to the fire than usual. I have some stew left from yesterday, he offered, moving to the kitchen area. Thank you, I haven't had a proper meal since I left the last town. She paused. I can cook tomorrow if you'd like to earn my keep. Mason wanted to tell her she didn't need to earn anything, that he owed her far more than a few meals and a roof, but he just nodded instead. They ate in awkward silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the wind's mournful keening. After dinner, Bethany insisted on washing the dishes despite his protestations. Mason watched her work, noting the efficiency of her movements and the determination in her posture. Why here? He finally asked. Why come all this way to the middle of nowhere? Bethany placed the last dish on the rack to dry before answering. I spent 4 years in Kansas City after Will died, working as a seamstress, living in a tiny room above a laundry, every day the same as the last. She turned to face him. Then last summer, I pulled out all of Will's old letters. He wrote about this place like it was heaven on earth, the mountains, the forests, the freedom. She walked to the window, gazing out at the swirling snow. I realized I was slowly dying in that city, so I sold everything I couldn't carry, bought a wagon and supplies, and headed west. Took me nearly 3 months to get here. Mason shook his head in disbelief. Most people are trying to get out of these mountains, not move into them, especially not a woman alone. I'm not most people, Mr. Riggs Mason will knew that. It's why he married me. There was a hint of defiance in her voice, but also something else, pride, perhaps, or conviction. That night, Mason lay on a bedroll near the fire, listening to the storm and the occasional creak from the bedroom where Bethany slept. The cabin felt different with her presence, warmer somehow, despite the howling wind outside. It had been years since he'd shared his space with anyone, and he found the sensation both strange and not entirely unwelcome. The storm lasted 3 days, during which an uneasy routine developed between them. Bethany took over the cooking, producing meals from Mason's simple provisions that tasted better than anything he'd managed in years. She also began cleaning, though she was careful not to overstep, asking permission before rearranging anything. Mason found himself spending more time indoors than was his habit, ostensibly to escape the weather, but increasingly because of the woman who had temporarily taken up residence in his home. They spoke little at first, but gradually, conversation became easier. "Will said you were the best tracker he ever knew," Bethany commented on the second evening as they sat by the fire. "Said you could find a man's trail in a hurricane." Mason snorted. "Will had a talent for exaggeration. He also said you were too modest for your own good." A small smile played at her lips. "What else did he say about me?" Mason asked, curious despite himself. Bethany considered for a moment. "That you were haunted by something, that you never spoke of your past before bounty hunting." She looked at him directly. "That you saved his life more than once before he saved yours." Mason stared into the fire, uncomfortable with the turn in conversation. "I should have saved him that last time. He made his choice," Bethany said softly. "Will always did exactly what he wanted to do. That's something I had to make peace with long ago." On the morning of the fourth day, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a crystalline world of white. Mason stepped onto the porch, Bethany beside him, both squinting in the sudden brightness. "I should get back to my land," she said, though there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. Mason frowned, looking toward the ridge. "That shelter you were building won't be enough, not with more winter ahead. I have no choice. I can't impose on you indefinitely." "It's not an imposition," he said quickly, surprising himself. "What I mean is, you need a proper cabin before you can stay out there. That takes time to build, and it's already winter." Bethany wrapped her arms around herself, considering the snow-covered landscape. "What do you suggest?" "Stay here until spring," Mason said, the words coming out before he could reconsider. "I'll help you build something proper when the weather breaks, something that will last." She looked at him skeptically. "Why would you do that?" "Because I owe it to Will," he almost said. But looking at her standing there in the morning light, auburn hair catching the sun, he realized there was more to it than obligation. "Because no one should face these mountains alone," he said instead. "Not even someone as stubborn as you." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "Almost as stubborn as you mean?" And so Bethany Roscoe stayed, what was meant to be a temporary arrangement stretching into weeks. December gave way to January, and the cabin that had once been a place of dust and silence began to transform. It started with the fire. Before Bethany's arrival, Mason had been frugal with firewood, burning just enough to keep from freezing. But Bethany insisted on keeping the hearth ablaze from dawn till well after dusk, filling the cabin with warmth that seemed to reach into its very corners. "Wood is one thing we have plenty of," she argued when he commented on it, "and life's too short to spend it shivering." The warmth was just the beginning. Next came the cleaning, a thorough, no corner spared effort that left Mason both impressed and slightly embarrassed at how he'd been living. Dust that had accumulated for years was banished. Windows that had been grimy were scrubbed until they gleamed. Even the rough-hewn furniture was sanded and oiled until the wood glowed in the firelight. Mason found himself drawn into her projects, at first reluctantly, then with increasing enthusiasm. Together they patched drafty spots in the walls, repaired the loose floorboard near the door that had been squeaking for months, and built proper shelving for the kitchen. "You're good with your hands," Bethany observed one afternoon as Mason installed the shelves. "Will mentioned you'd been a carpenter before turning to bounty hunting." Mason nodded, focused on his work. "My father was a builder, taught me everything he knew before he passed." "Why did you give it up?" He paused, hammer mid-swing. It had been years since anyone had asked him about his past, longer still since he'd spoken of it. "War changed things," he said finally. "Changed me, couldn't settle back into that life after what I'd seen, what I'd done." Bethany didn't press, and he was grateful for that. Instead, she handed him another nail and held the shelf steady while he worked. As January waned, the routine they established began to feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like something lasting. They shared the daily chores, with Mason handling the outdoor work, caring for the animals, chopping wood, clearing snow, while Bethany maintained the cabin and prepared their meals. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, often simply existing in a companionable silence that Mason found increasingly comfortable. It was during one such evening that Bethany brought out a small wooden box from her trunk, opening it to reveal a collection of seeds. "For a garden," she explained, laying out small paper packets on the table. "Come spring, tomatoes, beans, squash, carrots." Mason examined the packets with interest, never had much luck with growing things. "It just takes patience," she said, "and care, like most worthwhile things." Their eyes met over the table, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, of how their arrangement had evolved into something neither had anticipated. The moment was broken by a sharp gust of wind rattling the windows. Bethany gathered the seed packets back into their box, her cheeks slightly flushed. "I should turn in," she said, rising from the table. "Good night, Mason. Good night, Bethany." He remained by the fire long after she had gone to the bedroom, staring into the flames and wondering at the unfamiliar warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the hearth. February brought a brief thaw, and with it, visitors from town. Sheriff Patrick Dale and his deputy rode out to check on the more isolated homesteads following the heavy storms. "Heard from Ben Miller there was a woman staying with you," Dale said without preamble when Mason greeted them on the porch. "Thought I'd see for myself." Before Mason could respond, Bethany appeared in the doorway, drying her hands on her apron. "Sheriff," she greeted with a nod. "Deputy, would you care for coffee? It's just brewed." The lawmen exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her composed manner. "That would be much appreciated, madam," Dale replied, tipping his hat. Inside, Bethany poured coffee while Mason explained her situation, the land she'd inherited, the storm that had driven her to his cabin, their plan to build her own place come spring. "Riggs here did the right thing offering shelter," Dale said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of the propriety of the arrangement. "But folks in town talk, you understand." "I'm well aware of how people talk, Sheriff," Bethany replied coolly. "But I've never been one to let gossip dictate my choices. All the same, madam, if you'd be more comfortable in town, I'm perfectly comfortable where I am, thank you." The sheriff looked from Bethany to Mason and back again before nodding slowly. "Well then, just doing my duty checking in." After the lawman departed, a tension lingered in the cabin. Mason busied himself stoking the fire, avoiding Bethany's gaze. "Does it bother you?" she asked finally. "What they think." "Doesn't matter what anyone thinks," he replied gruffly. "It might if you plan to stay in this community." She sat at the table, fingers curled around her coffee cup. "I won't be the cause of difficulty for you." Mason turned to face her, suddenly weary of pretense. "The only difficulty would be if you left." The admission hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Bethany's expression softened, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. This time, it wasn't the sheriff returning, but 3 riders Mason recognized as ranch hands from the Edwards spread east of town. He stepped onto the porch to meet them, instantly wary of their hard expressions and the way they positioned their horses spread out, blocking the approach to the cabin. "Riggs," the leader, a man called Harley, greeted coldly. "Hear you got yourself a woman living here." "Will Roscoe's widow, no less." Mason's hand instinctively moved closer to his hip, where his revolver would have been if he were wearing it. "State your business or move on." "Our business is with the lady," another rider said. "Mr. Edwards don't approve of a woman living alone with a man she ain't married to, says it ain't decent." "Mr. Edwards should mind his own affairs," Mason replied, his voice dangerously low. "Thing is," Harley continued, dismounting, "Edwards owns half the valley now. Considers the moral character of its inhabitants his concern." He spat tobacco juice onto the snow, "especially when one of them is a known killer." Mason felt rather than saw Bethany step onto the porch behind him. "You gentlemen are trespassing on private property," she said firmly. "I suggest you leave immediately." Harley's gaze shifted to her, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Madam, we're offering you safe escort to town, away from this situation." "The only unsafe situation I see is 3 armed men threatening peaceful homesteaders," Bethany replied. "Now please leave, or I'll be forced to mention your trespassing to Sheriff Dale when next I see him." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then Mason caught the subtle shift in Harley's posture, the way his hand drifted toward his gun. In one fluid motion, Mason reached behind the door frame, grabbed his shotgun, and leveled it at the men. "She asked you to leave." The ranch hands froze, clearly not expecting this turn. Finally, Harley backed toward his horse. "This ain't over, Riggs." "Yes, it is," Mason replied evenly. "Tell Edwards if he's got concerns, he can come speak to me himself, man to man." The riders departed, but the encounter left a cloud over the cabin. That night, neither Mason nor Bethany mentioned what had transpired, but something had changed. The easy comfort that had developed between them was now tinged with an awareness of the outside world and its judgments. 3 days later, Mason was repairing the chicken coop when he spotted a lone rider approaching Calvin Edwards himself, owner of the largest ranch in the county, and a man who fashioned himself as the moral authority of Whitehorn. "Mr. Edwards," Mason greeted neutrally as the older man dismounted. "Riggs." Edwards was in his 60s, white-haired but still robust, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in the elements. "I believe we need to discuss your living arrangement." "Nothing to discuss," Mason replied, setting down his tools. "Mrs. Roscoe is my neighbor. She's staying here until spring when we can build her own cabin." Edwards raised a skeptical eyebrow. 6 months is a long time for a temporary arrangement. People are talking. Let them." "I knew William Roscoe," Edwards continued. "Not well, but enough to know he wouldn't want his widow living under these circumstances." The mention of Will sent a surge of anger through Mason. "You didn't know him at all if you think that. Perhaps not, but I do know what's proper." "What's Christian?" Edwards straightened his coat. "The church in town is holding a social this Sunday. I suggest you both attend, and perhaps use the opportunity to announce your intentions." "Intentions," Mason echoed, "to marry the woman Riggs or let her find more suitable arrangements in town." Edwards remounted his horse. "That's the only honorable path forward, as I'm sure you're aware." As the rancher rode away, Mason stood frozen in place, Edwards' words echoing in his mind. Marriage. The thought had never occurred to him, or rather, he hadn't allowed it to form fully in his consciousness despite the growing closeness between them. He found Bethany at the wash basin, sleeves rolled up as she scrubbed a sheet. She looked up as he entered, her expression shifting when she saw his face. "What's happened?" she asked, drying her hands. Mason relayed Edward's visit and his ultimatum, watching carefully for her reaction. "I see," she said when he finished, her voice measured. "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing, it's not his business what we do, but he's made it the town's business." She moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. "Perhaps I should go to town for a while, just until the gossip dies down. Is that what you want?" Mason asked, surprised by the hollowness her words created in his chest. "What I want?" She began, then trailed off, shaking her head. "What I want doesn't seem to matter much in this situation." "It matters to me," Mason said quietly. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "When I came here, I wasn't looking for complications. I just wanted a fresh start, a place of my own. I know. But now," she continued, "I find myself wondering what I would return to each night if I had that cabin across the ridge, if it would feel like home without." "Without what?" he prompted when she hesitated. "Without you," she finished simply. The admission hung in the air between them, charged with possibility. Mason crossed the room slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose. She didn't. "I'm not the man Will was," he said, stopping just short of touching her. "I'm rougher, older, set in my ways." A small smile touched her lips. "I've noticed. But these past months with you here," he gestured around the cabin, transformed by her presence. "I never knew what I was missing until you showed me." "And what was that?" "Life," he said simply. "Real living, not just surviving." Bethany's eyes softened. I've been surviving for 4 years, Mason, just going through the motions until I came here. He reached out hesitantly, taking her hand in his. It felt small and warm against his calloused palm. I don't want you to leave. Not to your own cabin, not to town, not anywhere. Are you proposing, Mason Riggs? She asked, her voice steady despite the flush creeping up her neck. I'm trying to, he admitted with a small laugh. Not doing a very good job of it, am I? I don't know, she replied, moving closer until he could feel the warmth of her breath. You haven't actually asked me anything yet, Mason took a deep breath. Bethany Roscoe, would you consider staying here permanently as my wife? For a moment she was silent, and fear gripped him that he had misread her, that the ghost of Will stood between them, that he had ruined the friendship they had built. Then she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that seemed to illuminate the cabin more brightly than any fire. Yes, she said. I would consider that very agreeable indeed. Their wedding was held in the town church 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony attended by the few friends Mason had made in Whitehorn and several curious townspeople drawn by the unusual romance. Sheriff Dale served as witness while the town's schoolteacher, Miss Hanson, stood up for Bethany. Edward sat in the front pew, satisfaction evident on his face at what he perceived as his moral victory. Mason didn't care. All he saw was Bethany in a blue dress she had altered specially for the occasion, her copper hair arranged with wildflowers Miss Hanson had preserved from the previous summer. I, Mason James Riggs, take thee, Bethany Ann Roscoe, to be my lawfully wedded wife, he vowed, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. When Bethany repeated the vows, her clear voice filling the small church, Mason felt something final settling into place, a piece of himself he hadn't realized was missing. They rode back to the cabin that afternoon, now legally and in the eyes of the community, husband and wife. The gossip that had threatened their peace was transformed overnight into a romantic tale that the townspeople would recount for years to come, how the widow had tamed the reclusive ex-bounty hunter, how love had found its way to the most unlikely of places. That evening, as snow began to fall once more, they sat before the fire, their fire hands intertwined. What will we do about my land? Bethany asked. Should we still build a cabin there? Mason considered this. Maybe not a cabin, but a barn, perhaps. We could expand the herd, maybe plant those crops you've been planning, make use of both properties. I'd like that, she said, leaning against his shoulder. A place that's truly ours, built together. Spring arrived early that year, the snow melting to reveal tender green shoots pushing through the soil. True to his word, Mason helped Bethany plant her garden beside the cabin, expanding it far beyond her original plans. They worked side by side, tilling the earth, setting fence posts, planning for a future that now stretched before them with possibility. On the ridge where Bethany's land met Mason's, they built not a cabin but a lookout point, a simple bench facing west, positioned to catch the sunset. It became their evening ritual to walk there together after the day's work was done, watching as the sky blazed with color before yielding to the night. Do you ever think about him? Mason asked one such evening, the question he'd been afraid to voice finally finding its way out. About Will. Bethany was quiet for a moment, her hand steady in his. Yes, she answered honestly. I think he would be happy knowing we found each other, that his two favorite people in the world weren't alone anymore. Mason nodded, a weight lifting from his heart. He saved my life that day, he said. But you saved something more, something I didn't even know needed saving. As darkness fell, they walked back to the cabin hand in hand. Through the window, they could see the warm glow of the fire Bethany had lit that morning, the fire that now burned continuously in their home, keeping the dust and cold at bay. It's never going out again, Bethany had declared on their wedding night. Not while I have breath in my body. And it never did. Through the changing seasons, through the years that followed, through the birth of their 2 children, a boy they named William and a girl they called Hope, the fire remained, a constant source of warmth at the center of the life they built together. The cabin that had once smelled of dust and loneliness became a home filled with light and laughter. And Mason Riggs, who had once believed his heart as barren as winter, discovered that spring could come again, even to the most unlikely places.